More than a century before, fierce African-American boxers named Lewis or Ali graced the ring, and in a time where the written word provided peopless media, came a legendary fighter named Bill Richmond, the first African-American sports star. Richmond was born into slavery on August 5, 1763 in Staten Island, New York. During his early life, Richmond's owner, the Reverend Richard Charlton, believed in educating his slaves in the hopes of accepting Christianity. During this period, Richmond was given an education and learned how to read and write. During Richmond's teen years, he served Hugh Percy, a lieutenant general in the British Army and second Duke of Northumberland, who convinced Charlton to release him. Richmond impressed Percy, who in turn freed him and not only established Richmond into his household, but continued to pay for his education in England. From here, Richmond was able to gain an apprenticeship in cabinet making, a reputable and profitable profession at the time, and very uncharacteristic for a black man in Georgian England. Even more uncharacteristic and often met with racial bigotry, he married a local white woman named Mary Dunwick, and the marriage continued for 40 years and produced 4 children. Because of racial insults, most of the time in defense of his wife's honor, Richmond got into several street brawls with white citizens of Yorkshire. Richmond, now into his 40s, would begin his boxing career. He was introduced into the world of prize fighting by a man named Thomas Pitt. Known for having a tenacious fighting style and never quit attitude, even in losses, he remained unbroken both in body and spirit. Richmond's prominent fights would see epic battles with younger and oftentimes larger white boxers. Both winning and losing, he displayed poise and grit, which helped him gain the respect of his opponents. His greatest rival would be Tom Cribbs, who was racially motivated when fighting Richmond and claimed to be the greatest fighter in England. This first fight drew over 15,000 people. The fight was uneventful, and according to locals, Richmond would lose, and this rivalry would continue for the rest of their lives. With his prize fight winnings, Richmond bought a pub named the Horse and Dolphin. Here he would meet Thomas Molyneux. Richmond would coach Molyneux, a younger African-American boxer and protege, to fight Thomas Cribbs. Richmond's last fight would be against Tom Shelton. He suffered a horrific eye injury early in the bout, but after 23 grueling rounds, he prevailed in epic fashion, dominating Shelton for the remainder of the fight. At 51 years old, he defied all stereotypes about African Americans and what it means to be a sportsman. Achieving fame as a trainer and later on in his retirement, Richard visited many European royals and was given the honor to stand as an usher for the coronation of King George IV. Later in life, Richmond and longtime rival Tom Cribbs would become great friends. Cribbs was by his side when he died in 1829.
In becoming one of the most overlooked fighters of his time, Richmond's rise to success was not without controversy, as he battled oppression in the colonies as a slave and in England as a free man. At the height of the Revolutionary War, Richmond liberated himself when his former master fled as the British were capturing New York. He soon entered the protection of British General Hugh Percy. It was under General Percy's guidance that Richmond, who was a free man, entered the war as a loyalist in the Queen's Army. As Kaufman would argue, we can see that Richmond took a nationalistic approach in battling the oppression he has experienced in the colonies by becoming a loyalist in the Queen's Army. After the war, Richmond decided to fight oppression in England, where his ascendance in British boxing presented a challenge not only to notions of racial hierarchy, but also to English nationalism and supposed scientific myths of black inferiority.
In 1763, Bill Richmond was born a slave. By age 40, he would be a free man, educated, with a good career, a white wife, and 4 children. He would go on to become the most famous black boxer ever to fight, the first truly international black athlete. To understand how Bill Richmond could come so far and rise so high, you have to understand the force of his character. In 1776, something very unusual happened. British General Hugh Percy convinced Reverend Charlton to allow his slave, Bill Richmond, to accompany him back to England. In 1777, 1 year after our founding fathers declared that all men were created equal, Percy rescued Richmond from a lifetime of slavery. Why did a British general choose a 13-year-old slave as his protege and continue to support him in his education and career? Percy was impressed by the young Richmond's intelligence, humor, and charisma. He entertained Percy at his master's table with impersonations of high-class visitors and an eloquent toast to King George. Even the ardent racists who would encounter Richmond later in life were forced to recognize his good manners, wit, and conversational skill. He would amuse others with tales of boxing matches, but was also intelligent and educated enough to converse on a range of subjects. Richmond's contemporary boxers were mostly illiterate and prone to liquor and gambling. Fellow ex-slave Tom Molyneux showed talent in the ring, but died in his 30s due to excessive drinking. Tom Shelton, the last man Richmond would ever fight, was dangerously obsessed with gambling. On one occasion, he hung himself after staking his life in a game of cards, but was rescued by a passerby. However, Shelton would kill himself by drinking acid when his uncontrolled gambling landed himself and his family in debtor's prison. By contrast, Bill Richmond had tremendous discipline and self-control. He rarely drank, never gambled, and maintained good health into old age through an active lifestyle. He did not even begin his athletic career until his 40s. At age 51, when he defeated the 23-year-old Tom Shelton, Richmond was said to look more than a dozen years younger his true age. Richmond was already disproving the stereotypes that Jack Johnson would face more than 100 years later. Black people were thought to be not just intellectually inferior to whites, but physically inferior, and too lazy and undisciplined to be taken seriously as athletes. However, Bill Richmond was both more intelligent and more disciplined than any of his white opponents. He also had an unbreakable self-esteem. Many of the lower-class white men who went into boxing were motivated by money, but Richmond already had a good job as a cabinet maker. The fact that he chose to pursue a dangerous career as a prize fighter shows that he was the kind of person who was always pushing himself further, always setting higher and higher goals. His fighting spirit could not be repressed by anyone or anything. Although Richmond succeeded in assimilating to white English society, he would continue to defend his honor against racist abuse, both with his words and with his fists. However, the portrayal in this picture is not quite accurate. Richmond did not attack his abusers in the street, but calmly and politely challenged them to matches at later dates. He did not lash out in anger, and he would not embarrass his wife by attacking a man in her presence. This is because Bill Richmond was a true gentleman. Although he was an agent of social progress, Richmond was also an assimilationist. When Hugh Percy rescued him from a lifetime of slavery, he won his eternal loyalty to the British Empire. Although he would face constant racism in Yorkshire, Richmond also had a good job, an education, a wife and family, and most importantly, his freedom. Bill Richmond embodied all of the qualities that British society most valued: courage, intellect, discipline, honor, and style. If he'd been born with white skin, he would surely have been considered the quintessential British gentleman. As it was, Richmond attained a degree of social integration unimaginable for a former slave. He was one of few pugilists who were respected both in the ring and in the court of the king. If Muhammad Ali symbolizes rebellion, and Jackie Robinson symbolizes integration, Bill Richmond was a synthesis of the two. He accepted the white man's values while also maintaining his dignity. He defended himself against racism while also maintaining good relationships with white people. He had the incredible ability to earn the respect of a racist society without compromising his own self-esteem. He always knew where to draw the line between resistance and acceptance. Richmond's story is of the type we wish could come true for everybody. That courage, intelligence, and perseverance can deliver us from the forces of injustice and bring the respect that we truly deserve. Richmond's story is astounding, but everyone who met him would attest that he was an astounding man. Not content with merely winning his freedom, he pushed himself to achieve athletic excellence and earned his place in the history books. His relentlessness carried him from victory to victory, but his eyes were always on the next opponent, the next obstacle to be overcome. His story is a small right in a world full of wrong.
The justice issue Bill Richmond was involved with was attacking structural racism and internalized racism, and Kaufman would say that he exemplified that by especially attacking the psychological aspect of racism and never giving false justification for his oppressors to oppress him. Author Dave Zirin once said that sports is much more than a mindless escape. It is a site of resistance. And in the case of Bill Richmond, every round he lasted and every victory he won showed to the white oppressor that he was capable of achieving the insurmountable. In contrast to his fellow sportsman, Muhammad Ali, Richmond didn't have the likes of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, and an ongoing civil rights movement to challenge structural racism. For Bill Richmond's battles were his own, and he was a one-man army. Richmond's display of his masculinity, skill, and a deep courage to keep up with acclaimed fighters of his day exemplified that he was fit for survival, and the social Darwinism theory that had yet to come to fruition already had its first outlier. Today we speak of acquiring capital as a means of climbing up the social ladder, but to Bill Richmond, his victories as an African American in all aspects of life was his capital to rise up the social ladder. The people of today would say that Bill Richmond was unsuccessful in his approach to defeating racism because he was buried in its history books. But Bill Richmond would not care, for his success and his praise by his contemporaries such as Tom Cribb and George Maddox was enough for him to understand that people will recognize racism as long as you stand up against it. The ultimate blow to structural racism and the psyche of white racist people of that period of time was Bill Richmond's ability to go from being property to owning property, such as the London Boxing Academy, and training the likes of white people who once persecuted him, such as William Hazlitt. According to Kaufman, we have access to truth through the mind, and only some people have cultivated the rational capabilities in such a way as to have access to this divine word of truth. Bill Richmond epitomizes such statement. Though free from slavery, Bill Richmond understood he was still shackled to a degree in not being able to indulge in all the economical, political, and social liberties as a common white man. But he remained steadfast in his belief that as long as he maintained emancipation of his mind, he would be undaunted in life.